The ruins of Berlin in May 1945 stood as a stark testament to the catastrophic failure of the Third Reich. Smoke drifted over mountains of rubble that had once been the administrative heart of a regime promising to last 1,000 years. The total destruction of the German capital was not merely the result of the final battle, but the culminating point of a war trajectory set in motion years before the first shot was fired. To understand the collapse of Germany, one must look past the final days in the bunker and examine the structural, economic, and strategic foundations upon which the German war machine was built. The seeds of defeat were sown in the very soil of the rearmament programs and the geopolitical gambles taken by the Nazi leadership during the 1930s. The story begins in the shadow of the First World War and the Treaty of Versailles, which imposed severe limitations on the German military and economy. Germany was stripped of its colonies, significant territories, and the ability to maintain a modern fighting force, fostering a deep national resentment that Adolf Hitler exploited to rise to power. The German economy in the early 1930s was fragile, battered by the Great Depression and hyperinflation that had wiped out the savings of the middle class. When the Nazi Party took control in 1933, they inherited a nation that was industrially potent but financially effectively bankrupt and lacking in essential raw materials. The immediate goal was rearmament, but this required vast resources that Germany simply did not possess within its own borders. To finance the rapid expansion of the Wehrmacht, the regime utilized a complex system of shadow financing masterminded by Hjalmar Schacht. Promissory notes known as Mefo bills were issued to contractors to hide the true scale of government spending from the international community and to circumvent inflation triggers. This economic house of cards created an illusion of prosperity and full employment, while the state drove itself into massive debt. The entire recovery was predicated on the idea that future military conquests would pay for the current expenditures through looting and exploitation of occupied territories. Thus, the German economy was not built for stability or endurance but was a predatory mechanism that required war to sustain itself. A critical weakness that plagued Germany from the start was its dependence on imported raw materials. A modern mechanized war requires oil, rubber, tungsten, chrome, and iron ore in massive quantities. Germany had plenty of coal but almost no domestic oil reserves and no natural rubber. The Nazi leadership attempted to solve this through a policy of autarky, or self-sufficiency, investing heavily in synthetic fuel and synthetic rubber plants. While these facilities produced significant amounts, they were expensive to build, energy-intensive to run, and never fully met the demands of a peacetime economy, let alone a total war. The rearmament of the German military was rapid but uneven and lacked a coherent long-term strategic vision. The Treaty of Versailles had forbidden Germany from having an air force or tank divisions, meaning they had to start from scratch. While this allowed them to adopt modern designs without the baggage of obsolete equipment, the pace of expansion led to standardization issues. The Wehrmacht that marched in military parades appeared invincible, yet it was suffering from a desperate shortage of transport vehicles and spare parts. The propaganda reels showed columns of tanks and half-tracks, but the reality of the logistics train was heavily reliant on horses. German military doctrine focused on the concept of Bürgerkrieg, or war of movement, which would later be dubbed Blitzkrieg by the Western press. This doctrine emphasized speed, surprise, and the concentration of force to encircle and destroy the enemy quickly. It was a tactic born of necessity because Germany knew it could not win a long, drawn-out war of attrition against resource-rich powers like Britain and France. The operational planning assumed short campaigns where victory would be secured before the enemy could mobilize their superior industrial reserves. This reliance on a short war meant that no serious preparations were made for a conflict lasting more than a few months. The Luftwaffe was designed primarily as a tactical air force intended to support ground troops rather than a strategic weapon capable of crippling enemy industry. The leadership of the Luftwaffe, particularly Hermann Göring and Ernst Udet, favored dive bombers like the Ju-87 Stuka and medium bombers like the Heinkel He-111. These aircraft were excellent for precision strikes on the battlefield but lacked the range and payload to strike deep into Russia or effectively blockade Britain. The decision to cancel the development of a four-engine heavy bomber, often referred to as the Eurobomber, would prove to be a fatal strategic error. Without a heavy bomber fleet, Germany had no means to project power against the industrial heartlands of its distant enemies. The German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, was also ill-prepared for the conflict that was approaching. The grandiose Plan Z, which envisioned a massive surface fleet to challenge the British Royal Navy, was scheduled for completion only in the mid-1940s. When war came in 1939, the plan was shelved, leaving Germany with a handful of capital ships and a submarine force that was too small to enforce an immediate blockade of the United Kingdom. Admiral Raeder famously wrote that the surface fleet could do little more than show how to die gallantly. The reliance on U-boats became the default strategy, but in 1939 Germany possessed fewer than 60 operational submarines, far short of the number required to strangle British trade. Diplomatically, Hitler gambled repeatedly that the Western democracies would not intervene as he dismantled the Versailles settlement piece by piece. The remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936, the Anschluss with Austria in 1938, and the annexation of the Sudetenland were strategic victories achieved without firing a shot. These successes emboldened Hitler and convinced him of his own infallibility and the weakness of his opponents. He began to dismiss the warnings of his general staff, who feared that the German army was not yet ready for a general European war. The generals knew that the fortifications on the French border were incomplete and that ammunition stocks were dangerously low. By 1939, the economic situation in Germany was becoming critical as the state burned through its foreign currency reserves to purchase raw materials. The regime faced a dilemma where they either had to slow down rearmament, which would cause an economic crisis and unemployment, or go to war to seize the resources they lacked. Hitler chose the path of aggression, targeting Poland as the next step in his quest for Lebensraum, or living space. He believed that Britain and France would back down again as they had in Munich. This miscalculation regarding the resolve of the Allies was the first of many strategic errors that would lead to ultimate defeat. The invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939, showcased the terrifying effectiveness of the German military machine when operating under ideal conditions. The combination of air superiority and armored thrust dismantled the Polish defense in weeks. However, the victory masked significant underlying issues within the Wehrmacht. Mechanical breakdowns among the tank divisions were higher than expected, and the expenditure of ammunition exceeded production rates. While the propaganda machine broadcast images of invincible steel columns, German logistics officers were already sounding alarms about fuel consumption and the wear and tear on vehicles. The declaration of war by Britain and France on September 3, 1939, came as a shock to Hitler, who had hoped to isolate Poland. Suddenly, Germany faced the prospect of a two-front war, the very scenario that had doomed it in 1918. Although the Western Front remained quiet during the period known as the Phony War, the strategic blockade by the Royal Navy began to tighten immediately. Germany lost access to global markets, cutting off imports of rubber, cotton, and rare metals from the Americas and Asia. The reliance on imports from the Soviet Union, secured through the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, became an essential but precarious lifeline. The Soviet supply line provided Germany with grain, oil, and manganese, allowing the Reich to circumvent the British blockade temporarily. This created a dangerous paradox where Germany was dependent on the very nation Hitler intended to eventually destroy. The Nazi ideology viewed the Soviet Union as the ultimate enemy, yet in 1940, the German war economy could not function without Stalin's shipments. This dependency lulled German planners into a false sense of security regarding their resource situation. They failed to implement total war mobilization measures in the civilian sector, believing that the current level of production was sufficient for the victories to come. During the winter of 1939 to 1940, the German military leadership scrambled to prepare for the invasion of France. The original plans were unimaginative, resembling a repeat of the Schlieffen Plan from World War I, which likely would have resulted in a stalemate. It was the intervention of General Erich von Manstein that shifted the focus to a daring armored thrust through the Ardennes forest. This plan was high risk, relying on the element of surprise and the assumption that French forces would be slow to react. The adoption of this plan highlighted a recurring theme in the German war effort: the reliance on tactical brilliance and high-risk gambling to overcome strategic disadvantages. The stunning success of the campaign in the West in May and June 1940 was the high-water mark of the Third Reich. The collapse of the French army in 6 weeks seemed to vindicate Hitler's leadership and the Blitzkrieg doctrine. The images of German troops marching down the Champs-Élysées convinced the world, and the Germans themselves, that the Wehrmacht was unstoppable. However, this victory proved to be a catastrophic long-term trap for the German mindset. It reinforced the belief that willpower and tactical aggression could solve any strategic problem, leading to a dangerous underestimation of the logistics and industrial power required for the next phases of the war. With the fall of France in June 1940, Great Britain stood alone against the German war machine, a situation that Adolf Hitler had neither planned for nor desired. The Nazi leadership operated under the assumption that the British government, seeing the hopelessness of its position and the dominance of Germany on the continent, would sue for peace. Hitler made vague overtures to London, hoping to secure a settlement that would allow him to turn his attention eastward to the Soviet Union. However, the appointment of Winston Churchill as Prime Minister signaled a hardening of British resolve and a refusal to negotiate. This diplomatic stubbornness presented Germany with a strategic problem for which it had no immediate solution. The German military lacked a coherent strategy for a cross-channel invasion, an operation that required naval and air superiority that the Reich did not possess. Operation Sea Lion, the proposed invasion plan, was hastily drawn up and fraught with logistical impossibilities. The German Navy had been severely depleted during the Norwegian campaign earlier in the year and lacked the destroyers and capital ships necessary to protect an invasion fleet from the Royal Navy. Furthermore, the Wehrmacht possessed no specialized landing craft, relying instead on converted river barges that were unsuited for the rough waters of the English Channel. These flat-bottomed barges would have been easily swamped by waves or decimated by British naval power before they even reached the beaches. To make an invasion even remotely feasible, the Luftwaffe needed to destroy the Royal Air Force and establish total air supremacy over southern England. The ensuing air campaign, known as the Battle of Britain, exposed the limitations of the German Air Force as a strategic weapon. The Luftwaffe's medium bombers carried insufficient bomb loads to permanently knock out British infrastructure, and the fighter escorts, primarily the Messerschmitt Bf 109, had limited range which severely curtailed their time over target. German intelligence regarding British defenses was also critically flawed, significantly underestimating the production rate of British fighters and the effectiveness of the radar network. The chain-home radar system allowed the RAF to intercept incoming German formations with efficiency, negating the element of surprise. A critical turning point in the air war occurred when the Luftwaffe shifted its focus from attacking RAF airfields and radar stations to bombing cities, specifically London. This decision, driven by a desire for retaliation and to break British morale, allowed the RAF Fighter Command vital time to repair its airfields and recover its strength. The Blitz caused immense destruction and loss of life in British cities, but it failed to cripple the war economy or the will of the people. By late September 1940, it became clear that the Luftwaffe had failed to achieve the necessary conditions for Operation Sea Lion. Hitler indefinitely postponed the invasion, leaving an undefeated enemy to his rear, a strategic failure that would haunt Germany for the remainder of the war. While the air war raged over Britain, Germany's strategic focus began to drift toward the Mediterranean, driven by the incompetence of its ally Italy. Benito Mussolini, eager to emulate Hitler's successes, launched ill-advised invasions of Egypt and Greece, both of which quickly turned into disasters. The Italian army in North Africa was routed by a much smaller British force, while the invasion of Greece bogged down in the mountains, threatening Germany's southern flank. Hitler was forced to intervene to prevent the collapse of his fascist partner, diverting valuable military resources away from the planned invasion of the Soviet Union. This dispersal of force was the beginning of a pattern where Germany constantly had to plug holes in the defenses of its weaker allies. To stabilize the North African front, Hitler dispatched a small expeditionary force known as the Afrika Korps under the command of General Erwin Rommel. Rommel proved to be a tactical genius, reversing the British gains and driving them back toward Egypt. But his success was a double-edged sword. The North African theater became a logistical sinkhole for the Wehrmacht, consuming fuel, trucks, and aircraft that were desperately needed elsewhere. The supply lines across the Mediterranean were constantly harassed by the Royal Navy and the RAF operating from Malta, leading to chronic shortages for the German forces. Rommel's tactical brilliance could not overcome the strategic reality that the war in the desert was a drain on German resources with little strategic payoff unless the Suez Canal could be captured, a goal that remained perpetually out of reach. Simultaneously, the situation in the Balkans required immediate German attention before the invasion of Russia could proceed. The coup in Yugoslavia and the Italian failure in Greece forced the Wehrmacht to launch a rapid campaign in April 1941 to secure the region. While the conquest of Yugoslavia and Greece was executed with characteristic speed and efficiency, it delayed the start of Operation Barbarossa by several critical weeks. German paratroopers suffered heavy casualties during the capture of Crete, effectively ending Hitler's willingness to conduct large-scale airborne operations. Although the Balkans were secured, the delay meant that the German army would have less time to achieve its objectives in Russia before the onset of the deadly winter weather. Despite the unresolved war with Britain, Hitler remained fixated on his primary ideological and strategic goal, the destruction of the Soviet Union. In December 1940, he signed Directive 21, setting the invasion of Russia in motion. The decision was driven by the belief that the Soviet Union was a rotten structure that would collapse after a sharp kick. The Nazi leadership viewed the Red Army as racially inferior and professionally incompetent, a view reinforced by the Soviet military's poor performance against Finland in the Winter War of 1939. This racial arrogance led to a catastrophic underestimation of Soviet reserves, industrial capacity, and the resilience of the Soviet soldier. German intelligence on the Soviet Union was woefully inadequate. The Abwehr, German military intelligence, had almost no accurate information regarding the number of Soviet tank divisions or the existence of new weapons like the T-34 tank. Planners estimated that the Red Army possessed about 200 divisions, whereas the actual number was closer to 400, with millions more reservists available for mobilization. The operational plan for Barbarossa relied on the assumption that the bulk of the Soviet army would be destroyed near the border battles, leaving the path to Moscow, Leningrad, and the oil fields of the Caucasus open. There was no contingency plan for a war that lasted into the winter or for a scenario where the Soviet government did not collapse. The economic rationale for the invasion was as pressing as the ideological one. Germany was suffering from severe shortages of grain and oil, and the leadership believed that seizing the resources of Ukraine and the Caucasus was the only way to sustain the war effort against Britain and potentially the United States. The hunger plan developed by Nazi bureaucrats envisioned the starvation of tens of millions of Soviet citizens to divert food supplies to the Wehrmacht and the German populace. Thus, the invasion was designed not just as a military conquest but as a campaign of plunder and extermination. The reliance on capturing enemy resources to fuel the advance created a fragile logistical tether that would snap under pressure. Logistics was the Achilles heel of Operation Barbarossa from the very beginning. The German supply system was based on the density of the rail network in Western Europe, but the rail infrastructure in Russia was sparse and operated on a wider gauge than German trains. This meant that German locomotives could not run on Soviet tracks until the rails were physically moved or captured rolling stock was utilized. Consequently, the Wehrmacht had to rely heavily on truck transport to bridge the gap between railheads and the front lines. However, the German army was not fully motorized. The vast majority of supplies were still moved by horses. As the army advanced hundreds of miles into the Soviet interior, the supply lines stretched to the breaking point. The terrain of the Soviet Union presented another formidable challenge that German planners had largely ignored. The few paved roads that existed turned into dust clouds in the summer, and impassable rivers of mud during the rainy seasons. The wear on German vehicles was astronomical, engines choked on dust, and suspension systems shattered on the rough tracks. Before the first snow even fell, the Wehrmacht was losing vehicles faster than German industry could replace them. The vastness of the theater meant that the concentration of force, the key to blitzkrieg, became increasingly difficult to maintain as the front line widened from 800 miles to over 1,200 miles. German industrial mobilization in 1941 was still not operating on a total war footing. Hitler, fearing a drop in domestic morale, refused to cut consumer goods production drastically. Factories were still running single shifts, and women were not conscripted into the workforce in large numbers, unlike in Britain or the Soviet Union. This reluctance to fully mobilize the economy meant that the Wehrmacht entered the largest land campaign in history with limited reserves of ammunition, fuel, and replacement parts. The assumption of a quick victory led to a reduction in armaments production plans in the summer of 1941, a decision that would prove disastrous when the war of attrition began in earnest. As June 22, 1941, approached, 3 massive German army groups assembled along the border, comprising over 3 million men, thousands of tanks, and aircraft. On paper, it was the most powerful invasion force ever assembled. Yet, beneath the surface, the force was brittle. It lacked strategic depth, its logistics were tenuous, and its intelligence was blind to the true scale of the enemy it was about to attack. The impending invasion was the ultimate gamble of the Nazi regime, staking everything on a swift knockout blow against an opponent they either understood nor respected. The stage was set for a conflict of unprecedented savagery that would consume the Wehrmacht. At 3:15 a.m. on June 22, 1941, the stillness of the midsummer night was shattered by the roar of thousands of German artillery pieces opening fire along a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Operation Barbarossa had begun, unleashing over 3 million Axis soldiers into Soviet territory in the largest military invasion in human history. The Luftwaffe immediately struck Soviet airfields, destroying thousands of aircraft on the ground before they could even scramble to defend their airspace. The initial tactical surprise was absolute, as Stalin had refused to believe the intelligence reports warning of the impending attack. German panzer divisions sliced through the disorganized Soviet defenses, advancing dozens of miles within the first day and creating chaos in the Red Army's command structure. In the opening weeks, the German advance seemed to confirm the optimistic predictions of the Nazi leadership. Massive encirclement battles at Białystok and Minsk resulted in the capture of over 300,000 Soviet prisoners and the destruction of enormous quantities of Soviet material. The speed of the panzer groups, led by commanders like Guderian and Hoth, left the Soviet infantry far behind, trapped in vast pockets that were slowly reduced by the following German infantry. To the outside world, it appeared that the Soviet Union was collapsing just as France had done a year earlier. However, the sheer scale of the Soviet losses masked a worrying reality for the German invaders. The Russians kept fighting even when surrounded, forcing the Wehrmacht to expend precious ammunition and time to clear the pockets. Despite the stunning territorial gains, the friction of war began to grind down the German war machine almost immediately. The heat of the Russian summer was oppressive, and the dust churned up by thousands of tracks and wheels clogged the air filters of tanks and trucks, causing engines to fail at alarming rates. The logistical plan, which was already fragile, began to unravel as the advance moved further away from the railheads. The rail gauge difference meant that supplies had to be offloaded from German trains and reloaded onto trucks or captured Soviet rolling stock, creating massive bottlenecks at the border. By mid-July, many panzer divisions were halting not because of enemy resistance, but because they had outrun their fuel trucks. Resistance stiffened significantly as the Germans approached Smolensk, the traditional gateway to Moscow. The Battle of Smolensk in July and August became a brutal slugging match that slowed the German advance to a crawl and inflicted heavy casualties on the invaders. While the Germans eventually closed the pocket and captured another massive haul of prisoners, the delay proved critical. The fighting revealed that the Red Army was capable of mobilizing reserves far faster than German intelligence had predicted. New Soviet armies seemed to appear from nowhere to man the defensive lines, shattering the illusion that the Soviet manpower pool was on the verge of exhaustion. By late August, a major strategic dispute erupted within the German High Command regarding the next phase of the operation. The Army High Command, particularly General Halder, argued for an immediate, and direct thrust toward Moscow to decapitate the Soviet government and destroy the main communications hub of the country. Hitler, however, intervened with a different priority, fixating on the economic resources of Ukraine and the threat posed by Soviet forces on the southern flank. He ordered the center of gravity to shift south to encircle Kiev, a decision that would delay the attack on Moscow by several weeks. This decision highlighted Hitler's tendency to prioritize economic goals and flank security over the traditional military objective of the enemy capital. The diversion to Kiev resulted in the greatest encirclement battle in history, a tactical masterpiece that trapped over 600,000 Soviet soldiers and secured the agricultural wealth of Ukraine for the Reich. From a tactical perspective, it was a resounding victory that eliminated the Soviet southwestern front and opened the door to the Crimea and the Donbass industrial region. However, strategically, it consumed the precious operational time of September, the last month of good weather before the autumn rains. The German generals watched with growing anxiety as the days grew shorter, knowing that the window for a decisive victory in 1941 was rapidly closing. The victory at Kiev, while impressive, had bought the Soviet Union time to strengthen the defenses around Moscow. In October 1941, the Wehrmacht finally launched Operation Typhoon, the belated drive to capture Moscow. Initially, the operation yielded success, with another massive encirclement at Vyazma bringing the total number of Soviet prisoners taken in 1941 to over 3 million. Panic briefly gripped Moscow as government ministries began to evacuate to Kuibyshev, and looting broke out in the streets. German reconnaissance units reportedly got close enough to see the spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars. But just as the final objective seemed within grasp, the Russian weather intervened with a vengeance. The autumn rains, known as the Rasputitsa, turned the unpaved Russian roads into impassable rivers of sticky mud that trapped vehicles up to their axles. The entire German logistical system collapsed. Horse-drawn wagons could not move, trucks sank, and the advance ground to a literal halt. Artillery and ammunition could not be brought forward, and the tanks, the spearheads of the Blitzkrieg, became stationary targets. The Wehrmacht was forced to wait for the ground to freeze so that mobility could be restored. During this enforced pause, the Soviet High Command, under Georgy Zhukov, worked feverishly to reinforce the Moscow defense lines, digging anti-tank ditches and laying minefields. When the temperature finally dropped in November, the ground hardened, allowing the tanks to move again, but the freeze brought a new, more deadly enemy. The German army was completely unprepared for winter warfare, as the leadership had arrogantly assumed the campaign would be over before the first snow. Soldiers lacked winter coats, gloves, and felt boots, forcing them to stuff newspapers into their uniforms to survive the sub-zero temperatures. Weapons malfunctioned as the oil froze in the breeches, and vehicle engines had to be kept running constantly or fires lit under them to prevent the blocks from cracking. Frostbite began to claim more casualties than enemy fire, sapping the morale and fighting strength of the frontline units. Despite the horrific conditions, the Wehrmacht made one last desperate lunge for Moscow in early December. Infantry units pushed into the suburbs, engaging in close-quarters combat with desperate Soviet defenders. However, the German offensive had reached its culmination point. The troops were exhausted, their equipment was failing, and they were at the very end of a supply line that stretched back over 1,000 miles. On December 5, 1941, the Soviet Union launched a massive counter-offensive, utilizing fresh divisions transferred from Siberia. These troops, well equipped for winter warfare and led by experienced commanders, smashed into the overextended German lines. The Soviet counterattack caught the Germans completely off guard, threatening to turn the retreat into a rout reminiscent of Napoleon's disaster in 1812. The German front threatened to disintegrate as units were pushed back tens of miles, abandoning heavy equipment and wounded comrades in the snow. In this moment of crisis, Hitler took personal command of the army, firing the commander-in-chief von Brauchitsch and several other top generals, including Guderian. He issued a stand-fast order, forbidding any retreat and demanding that troops fight where they stood. While this order likely prevented a total collapse of the front, it condemned thousands of soldiers to death by freezing and encirclement in untenable positions. As the disaster unfolded outside Moscow, a global event occurred that would seal the fate of the Third Reich. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, bringing the United States into the war. 4 days later, on December 11, Hitler made the inexplicable strategic error of declaring war on the United States. He believed that Japan would distract the Americans in the Pacific and that German U-boats could cut the Atlantic supply lines. This decision instantly turned the European conflict into a truly world war and pitted Germany against the immense industrial potential of the world's largest economy. Germany was now fighting the British Empire, the Soviet Union, and the United States simultaneously, a coalition with vastly superior resources and manpower. By the end of 1941, the myth of German invincibility had been shattered in the snows of Russia. The Blitzkrieg strategy, which relied on quick victories to avoid a war of attrition, had failed. Germany faced a long, drawn-out war on multiple fronts for which it was economically and militarily unprepared. The losses in men and experienced officers during the first 6 months of the Eastern Campaign were irreplaceable. While the Wehrmacht remained a formidable fighting force, it had lost its prime offensive capability. The failure to take Moscow and the entry of the United States marked the strategic turning point where victory became mathematically impossible, though the war would rage on for 3.5 more bloody years. The German war economy, still not fully mobilized, struggled to replace the material losses of the winter crisis. Tank production in 1942 was only marginally higher than in 1941. While Soviet and American production began to skyrocket. The German leadership began to look for a new strategy to regain the initiative in 1942. Realizing they no longer had the strength to attack along the entire Eastern Front, they decided to focus their efforts on the southern sector. The goal was to capture the oil fields of the Caucasus, a resource prize that Hitler believed was essential to continuing the war. This plan, codenamed Operation Blue, would lead the German army to a city on the Volga River named Stalingrad. The failure of logistics in 1941 had forced a reassessment of the German supply system, but the fundamental problems remained unsolved. The reliance on rail transport was still hampered by the gauge issues and the increasing activity of Soviet partisans behind the lines. These partisans, operating in the vast forests and swamps of Belarus and Ukraine, began to wage a guerrilla war that tied down security divisions and disrupted the flow of supplies to the front. The brutality of the German occupation, driven by Nazi racial ideology, had alienated the local population, turning potential allies who despised Stalin into fierce enemies fighting for their survival. This rear-area insecurity further strained the already overstretched German manpower. As the sun set on 1941, the Third Reich stood at a precipice, staring into an abyss of its own making. The gamble of a short, decisive campaign had failed, buried under the snowdrifts outside Moscow and the charred wreckage of the logistics train. The entry of the United States into the conflict transformed the European conquest into a global war of attrition, pitting Germany's limited resource base against the combined industrial might of the British Empire, the Soviet Union, and America. The Wehrmacht had lost its aura of invincibility, and the specter of a long, grinding slaughter replaced the early dreams of quick victory. The road to defeat was now paved. The only question remaining was how long the bloody journey would last and how many millions would perish before the final collapse.